It may not be obvious to everyone, but the old world order is fading. For decades, the West sat at the top, calling the shots, shaping economies, and deciding the fate of nations. That dominance is slipping away.
We have to be clear about the fact that our Europe today is mortal. It could die. It could die, and that depends solely on our choices.
The cracks began to show with the Russia-Ukraine war. Suddenly, the power of the West didn't look so unshakable anymore. And then came Trump's America First policy.
As President of the United States, I will always put America first. I will very simply put America first. America first!
An inward turn that sped up the unraveling. Now, the shift is clear. Around the globe, countries are moving away from the old system of Western control.
Now, since the end of the Second World War, the American dollar has been the backbone of global finance. But that dominance appears to be fast slipping, and leading the efforts are the BRICS nations, a group that is accused by American President Donald Trump of harboring anti-American policies.
They are pushing toward a new vision, a multipolar world, where power is shared instead of hoarded. Africa is not standing still in this transformation. Day by day, more African nations that once clung tightly to Western influence are breaking free. They are choosing new partners, forming stronger ties with nations outside the Western sphere. But the big questions remain. What pushed this change? And is it truly a step toward freedom, or just another trap in disguise? 3 decades after the Cold War ended, the world is shifting again. The old order, where the West dominated everything, is under attack. And leading this pushback are Russia and China, joined by a rising chorus of nations in the global South, nations tired of Western excess and control. One of the key battlegrounds in this struggle is Africa. The continent has become central to the fight over influence and power. But why? Africa matters for 4 crucial reasons. First, it is the largest regional bloc in the United Nations, holding nearly 28% of all votes in the General Assembly. In global politics, numbers like that carry weight. Second, Africa is rich in minerals, some of them so rare they can only be found on this continent. These resources fuel industries, armies, and entire economies. Whoever controls them controls the future. Third, Africa's geography places it at the heart of vital sea trade routes, especially in the east. From the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, these waters are lifelines for global commerce. And finally, Africa is young. It is home to the fastest growing youth population in the world. By 2030, almost half of the planet's young people will be African. That's not just a statistic. It's the future labor force, the future innovators, the future leaders of the world. With all this in mind, it's no surprise why every global power wants a stake in Africa. The question is, who will Africa choose and at what cost? Back in 2022, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken declared that America was Africa's best partner, but promised Washington would never force Africa to choose sides. Well, fast forward to today, and the continent has made its choice. And that choice is China. As you can imagine, the United States is not happy. In fact, congressional leaders are now weighing a rewrite of U.S. trade policy, one designed to pressure Africa into picking between Washington and Beijing. But before we get to America's reaction, let's take a closer look at China's growing relationship with Africa and why it feels so different from the one Africa has had with the West. Over the last 2 decades, China has expanded its footprint across Africa at an astonishing pace. Roads, railways, ports, dams, critical infrastructure worth over $140 billion in loans has transformed skylines and connected nations. By 2020, at least 49 African countries had signed onto China's Belt and Road Initiative, a vast project linking continents through trade and infrastructure. And the numbers keep climbing. In trade alone, the figures tell the story. In 2000, China-Africa trade stood at just $11.67 billion. By 2022, it had exploded to $257.67 billion, making China not just a major partner, but the single biggest trading partner for much of the continent. For Africa, China has become more than just a foreign investor. It has become the symbol of a new kind of partnership. Interestingly, the rise of China's investment in Africa hasn't gone unnoticed. In fact, it has been sharply criticized by the West. But here's the question: why? Isn't that a little hypocritical? For decades, Western nations poured their own investments into Africa. Even today, though smaller than before, that flow of money still exists. So what makes Western investment good, while China's is painted as bad? Western critics point to something they call debt trap diplomacy. According to this claim, China deliberately hands out loans that poor countries cannot afford to repay. And when the debt piles up, Beijing is accused of swooping in, taking control of key resources and assets. The examples most often cited are Zambia and Uganda. Take Zambia. The country is drowning in debt with roughly $5 billion owed to China alone. That makes up about 30% of its total foreign debt and nearly 20% of its entire GDP. Numbers like that don't just weigh on a country's books, they weigh on its sovereignty. But advocates for China's role in Africa see things differently. They argue that Chinese investment has brought real, visible change to the continent. Roads, bridges, ports, things people can actually use. They point to the jobs created, the new businesses that spring up, and even the digital connections that bring Africa closer to the rest of the world. Take Kenya, for example. The railway linking Nairobi to Mombasa is more than just tracks and steel. It is a lifeline for trade, a boost for tourism, and a spark for local economies. For many, it represents what Western promises have often failed to deliver: tangible progress. Still, critics remain unmoved. They warn that these benefits are overshadowed by long-term dangers. The lack of transparency in loan agreements, they say, makes countries vulnerable. Exploitative terms can slowly erode sovereignty, leaving nations trapped in financial dependence. But here's the big question, one the Western critics rarely answer. How is China's lending any different from the loans pushed by the Western-controlled World Bank and IMF? Both create debt. Both come with strings attached. So why is one called investment and the other called exploitation? For those who don't know, there are actually more reports of the World Bank and IMF undermining African sovereignty than there are of China. If you think about it carefully, China's loan agreements often look more like mutual benefit than the so-called assistance Africa receives from the West. Since independence, the United States and Europe have viewed Africa through one lens, that of a continent in need of help. Their approach has been to provide aid and social services with a heavy focus on humanitarian assistance. On the surface, it sounds noble. But here's the catch. That aid always comes with strings attached. The West dresses it up with words like governance, transparency, and human rights. But in reality, these conditions are instructions, telling African nations how to run their governments, how to manage their economies, even how to shape their societies. And when those conditions aren't met, the money stalls. Disbursements are delayed. Sometimes the aid never arrives at all. In the end, the lifeline that was promised becomes another tool of control. This is why, in recent years, during high-level summits between Africa and the West, you'll often hear a common theme from African leaders: disappointment. Again and again, the continent has been promised billions in aid and financial support. And yet, more often than not, those promises remain just that, talk. The money rarely arrives, and when it does, it comes tied with strings that cut deep into sovereignty. With China, the story is different. As we mentioned earlier, Beijing's approach is not about dangling promises, it's about action. Roads, ports, railways, bridges, massive infrastructure projects built under its Belt and Road Initiative. And here's the key difference. Unlike Western aid, which always comes with political or economic conditions, China's investments are largely free of such demands. No lectures, no governance checklists, no hidden clauses about how a nation should run its affairs. For African leaders, this is far more appealing. Infrastructural development isn't charity, it's the backbone of economic growth. Leaders are tired of being treated as beggars, waiting for approval from the West in exchange for aid. What they want are partnerships built on trade, business, and mutual benefit. And in China, they see a partner willing to treat them not as dependents, but as equals. This shift in Africa's partnerships is not just about today. It's a reflection of decades of experience, decades of choices, promises, and disappointments. And you can see it clearly in the way African leaders now prioritize economic collaboration and infrastructure development with China. But let's rewind. This story didn't begin with Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. It began much earlier, back in the 1950s and 60s, when African nations first gained independence. At that time, the West, through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, stepped in with significant funding. The goal, at least on paper, was to help the newly independent states stabilize, grow, and thrive. And yes, that money built things. Schools, hospitals, transport networks, entire institutions rose up with Western support. For a moment, it looked like Africa might finally step into a brighter future. But here's the catch. Those loans were never free. They came tied to strict conditions. And with them came a program that would shape Africa's economic destiny for decades to come, the Structural Adjustment Program. The Structural Adjustment Programs were sold as solutions, but in reality, they were traps. These neoliberal policies pushed privatization, austerity, and forced market liberalization. On paper, it sounded like modernization. In practice, it opened Africa's markets to European multinationals, creating massive profits for foreign companies while devastating local economies. In the 1980s and 1990s, just as most African nations were struggling to stand firmly after independence, the effects hit hard. Incomes collapsed, poverty soared, entire economies slipped into decades of stagnation and recession, and the impact didn't end there. To this day, the shadow of those programs lingers, shaping how African nations function, limiting their growth and widening the gap between Africa and the rest of the world. Once the SAPs were forced through, the West shifted its focus. Instead of loans for major infrastructure, it leaned heavily on aid. But the aid came with the same old story: conditions, conditions, and more conditions. Every dollar tied to a demand. China, however, chose a different path. In those same decades, its engagement with Africa was less about money and more about solidarity, ideological support, political support, a promise to stand with Africa against colonialism and imperialism. And it wasn't just talk. In the 1960s, China proved that commitment with one of its most symbolic projects, the Tanzania-Zambia Railway. A lifeline across southern Africa, built not as a tool of control, but as a declaration. Africa's development could be free from Western colonial influence. Now let's address the accusation that China's loans are nothing but a debt trap. The reality is more complex. Beijing offers Africa three main types of loans, and none of them carry the political or economic strings that Western aid is famous for. The first are zero-interest loans. These are part of China's foreign aid programs, with no interest attached. They are typically directed towards social and humanitarian projects, schools, hospitals, clean water. In many ways, they act as gestures of goodwill, designed to strengthen diplomatic ties and trust. Then there are concession loans. These are offered at interest rates far below the market average, with long repayment windows. They are often used to fund large-scale infrastructure projects, railways, highways, power plants. Loans of this kind are managed by China's policy banks, including the China Exim Bank and the China Development Bank. Each type of loan serves a specific purpose, but together they represent a financing approach that African leaders see as more flexible, more practical, and far less patronizing than the aid programs they've endured from the West. The last category of China's lending is commercial loans. These come with higher interest rates, closer to what private banks would charge. But they are tied to projects that are commercially viable, ventures in mining, telecommunications, or other large-scale industries that can generate enough revenue to cover repayment. These loans are often handled by Chinese commercial banks. And yes, sometimes additional terms are attached if a borrower fails to pay on time. But that is standard practice in global finance. After all, China is also a sovereign nation. It has every right to protect its investments. So the question is, how exactly are these loans harmful to Africa? No one is forcing countries to take them. What makes this even more striking is what happens when repayment becomes impossible. While the West warns of debt traps, China has a record of forgiveness. In 2022 alone, Beijing canceled 23 loans owed by African nations, and this is not unusual. As recently as April 2024, China wrote off an unspecified amount of Zimbabwe's interest-free loans, while also pledging to help the government navigate its debt crisis. Now ask yourself, how much African debt has the West ever canceled? The uncomfortable answer is none. Instead, what we see is something far more unfair. An African nation, already buried in debt, goes to the World Bank for help and is handed a loan with interest rates as high as 10%. Meanwhile, Western nations borrowing from those same institutions are charged less than 1%. Think about that. The struggling borrower pays more, while the wealthy borrower pays less. If that isn't bias, what is? With realities like this, it becomes clear why African countries are leaning toward China rather than Western-controlled institutions. But as we mentioned earlier, Washington is not happy. US lawmakers are now considering rewriting trade policy to force Africa to pick a side. On June 12th, the House Ways and Means Committee opened hearings on the future of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. And with those hearings came threats. Any African nation that defies US interests could be expelled from the program. But even former US officials admit that this strategy is doomed to fail. Forcing Africa to choose between America and China is a losing proposition. Why? Because what exactly does the US have to offer? If expelled from AGOA, African economies may take a hit, but they won't collapse. The continent now has other options: China, Russia, and a rising multipolar world order. Look at South Africa. When Washington slapped a 30% tariff on its goods, Pretoria quickly moved to soften the blow, seeking new partnerships and new markets. The message was clear: Africa will not be cornered. And so, as we said at the beginning of this video, times are changing. The dominance once held by the United States and the West is slipping away. The old system is becoming obsolete. But the only ones who seem unwilling to face that reality are the West itself. So, what do you think? Is Africa's shift toward new partners the dawn of a brighter future or the start of a dangerous gamble? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.